Hello, my name is Buki Fatona. I am a doctoral researcher at the University of Oxford. Welcome to Phil-Sci-Theo, an 8-part discussion series on topics in the intersect of philosophy of science and religion.
You rightly point out the difficulty in defining what religion is. So you go on to offer a minimalist definition. Could you explain what this minimalist definition is?
Yes, I'm very conscious of the fact that probably the most difficult thing to hit the academic definitional board has been religions. Nobody seems to agree. I guess I come at these kind of things. I mean, if you read the literature in sort of anthropology and sociology of religion and various other areas, it's sometimes very torturous. Biologists, which is part of my traditional background, as it were, one foot in the biology camp, tends to be very laid back and say, well, actually, we never know exactly what the definition of anything is. It's better to just do our best and have something that allows us to go a few steps down the road. And if we got it wrong, the few steps down the road will sort it out. But if we're right, we've made some progress. We're never going to get the definition of any phenomenon completely right. Mm-hmm. And coming out of that tradition, my view is simply, as much as anything, to say that, well, religion is this sense of experiences in a transcendental sort of world, that there is a world beyond the world we live in that's peopled by beings of some kind, and this seems to me to characterize most of the kinds of religions that we see. So if you think of them, the kind of oldest religions, which are all really religions of experience and immersion rather than theologies. Often they don't have a theology. It's all about trance experiences. You go into trance and you visit the spirit world, and the spirit world is peopled with ogres who endeavor to trap you there. And your ancestors who act as guides and help you find your way back out, back into the real world after your trance experience. Those, I don't think those kind of experiences have ever gone away. There tends to have been historically a view that there are kind of primitive religions, animist religions, as they were originally called in Victorian times when they're set up. And then there were kind of doctrinal religions, which came into being at some point, obviously reflected in the kind of great world religions, full of theology and doctrine and all sorts of other stuff, most of which are only actually a couple of thousand years old, 3,000 at a push for the oldest. And sort of in between, there are some strange semi-doctrinal religions. You think of the religions of Egypt, classical Egypt, and so on and so forth. The religions of, the Northern Europeans, the Vikings, and the Celts, and the Romans, and the Greeks, and so on. Because the doctrinal religions are almost always, as we have them, monotheistic, whereas these intermediate religions are polytheistic. So, there's been this tendency to see these, sort of modern religions as sort of appearing out of nowhere and being very different. In one sense, of course, they are, but actually, when you look closely at it, the things that make these small-scale traditional religions, as you might, I'm still inclined to call them animist religions, because they're about anima, spirits. Yeah. The spirit world, that there is still there, rumbling quietly to itself under all the modern religions, and it's what gives us mystical experiences of trance and so on, these kind of things. What seems to have happened, I think, is much more a layering of layers of theology on top. You can provide whatever explanation you like for those layerings. They're being given to us by a particular messenger from God, perhaps a revealed religion. I'll remain neutral on that. It doesn't really affect the argument. The question, it's much more, to me, a question of, you've got these heavily trance-based religions, which all these so-called primitive religions are. They're all based around trance experiences. They have no theology particularly, and no gods as such. And then, sort of sometime around, I don't know, 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, you get this sea change with the introduction of doctrinal religions, with gods now up there, often many gods. And so you have priests who have to look after the gods and intervene between us humble peasants out here and the gods. And mostly those kind of gods are a bit vindictive, is the impression one gets, And then, the third phase, as I see it when you look at the history of religion, is, appears, as I say, 2,000-3,000 years ago, the appearance of the modern world religions as we have them. They all kind of appear in different places pretty much around the same time. There are historical links between them. Obviously, the Abrahamic religions, didn't all occur at the same time. They're a historical sequence, but essentially within the same 1,000, 1,500 years. And then I think you get a really big sea change in the style of religion, because these are all almost without exception monotheistic, or effectively monotheistic, and they have a completely different sense and conception, if you like, of spirituality and God and so on. But you can see that it's almost as though it's building step by step, which in itself is interesting, but it does correlate with, I think, the growing size of communities that people are being forced to live in, and that there seems to be a very, very strong correlation there, that you can have animist type religions in hunter-gatherer societies because they're small scale, and it works to build this sense of belonging in the community. But as we start living in ever larger villages, towns, cities, states, the tensions of doing so require much, much more powerful management, if you like. And that the really core to that management, how that was done, I think, has been the style of religions that have come into play. The doctrinal religions, in particular, appearing sometime around 7,000 or 8,000 years ago. And interestingly, doing so in a very narrow band across the world. They appear in the same time in just this very narrow band, which is essentially the latitude of the Mediterranean, of course, but going on across the Ganges plain in India and into the Great Basin in China. All the great world religions as we have them now emerge in that zone, latitudinal zone, and in the same roughly time frame. And these seem to be correlated with a dramatic increase in the size of communities. It's when states go through the sort of 1 million person mark, and you really seem to need something very, very, very firm to stop people behaving so badly to each other in the way they invariably seem to do if they're left to their own devices.
Interestingly, maybe a parallel movement was happening in mathematics, and probably for the same reasons. More complex societies, therefore more complex calculations required, and also transmission from one nation or city to another, because people were moving around in far more sophisticated ways. So I think there's some kind of interesting parallel to be drawn there between the evolution of mathematics and religion.
That may well be true, but I would probably hazard the guess, at least, that this is also related to the development of more sophisticated philosophies,
yes,
which goes hand in hand with the development of more sophisticated theologies.
Yes.
Right? So people are starting to ask deeper questions about how and why the world works as it is. As this is sort of the period also when you start to get an understanding of things like astronomy. Okay, sometimes it's kind of a bit exotic, but the sense that somebody has the leisure to sit there and spend all night watching the stars, or all day watching the seasons pass and thinking about what's going on. This all seems to really start happening with the beginnings of agriculture and living in large settled communities, essentially in the Neolithic. I suspect they're all these kind of, if you like, generic philosophical developments are all driven partly by the fact that somebody, usually they're called priests, or they were called priests in some temple or other, had time on their hands and the leisure to do it.
Yes.
But, they didn't have to spend their lives grubbing away in the soil to get to grow some food. They had the time to reflect on the world as we experienced it and as they experienced it, and try to explain it on the one hand. And then, of course, out of that inevitably comes, I think, almost unavoidably, if you like, came theology, because that was backed off of this very, very deep, historically very deep, trance-based types of religion that the Victorians referred to as animism, which I think is actually perfectly okay. It became one of those words that was sort of banished. We weren't allowed to use it, but actually I think it captures quite well what's involved, because it is all about your experience of the anima inside you, as it were. These trance-based religions, of which we still have many associated with the few remaining small-scale societies that exist, but I think still are there in all the great world religions. They're the mystical component that people still in the heights of religious experience go into trance and have trance experiences. We may not do it every day, but it does happen, and some people seem to experience it much more than others. But I think those trance-based type religions, which typically lack a theology, they lack any kind of temples or churches or anything like that, any religious spaces, they lack a priesthood, they tend to be very casual. I think they're very, very ancient indeed, and go back certainly to the beginnings of our species, and maybe before that to the archaic humans that we sprang out of, our species sprang out of. They're extremely emotionally powerful kinds of activities, and there still are people who experience them in religious ecstasy, in that sense, what Ronald Knox would have called ecstasy in his wonderful book on ecstasy. It's very powerfully moving experience to have, and also, of course, it takes you into realms which are beyond your ken to understand. You can't explain in everyday terms because it appears to be different. So I think that kind of layer is still there with us in the modern world, in all the world religions, and there are many different manifestations, some more than others, sort of. Think of the great Christian mystics on the one hand, and the Pentecostal tradition of speaking in tongues on the other hand, and so on and so forth. And all the great religions have these. They're there in streams of Judaism. They're there streams of Islam, and so on. So it's very, very ancient. I think that the deeply theological stuff of modern revealed religions are much, much later, as we understand historically. We know for most of them when they actually happened, because a particular person, prophet or whoever, or guru or whatever, is historically known to be the person who started it or wrote it all down for us, or whatever it may be. Those come very late, and they seem to reflect the rising stresses of living in more and more complex and larger, crammed together communities. During the last few thousand years.
Yes. Maybe this takes us off course a tiny bit, but when you were talking about trance experiences, I thought about football and how, in a sense, if we take a minimalist definition of religion, maybe it could apply there, because watching football fans celebrate a win, they look like they are. It's a religious
ecstatic, yes.
A cathedral, worshippers in a cathedral having an ecstatic experience.
Yeah. This is true. I think we are, as a species, prone to it. I think it is peculiar to humans. I don't think any other living animal species shows anything remotely like this. It is a peculiar thing to humans. And I don't think probably goes back very deep, maybe to our very close predecessors and relatives like the Neanderthals and so on. Who also seem to have spent quite a lot of time in deep caves where you get these kind of out-of-body experiences associated with trance. But those, I suppose in this sense, that kind of ecstatic experience that you might get at a football match just reflects the fact that these components, these experiences, are part and parcel of the way we create bonded communities, secular bonded communities. Forget the religious component. And these are, as I referred to earlier, the set of behaviors that seem to be very good at creating this sense of community. They all trigger the endorphin system, and it's that creates, essentially, if we do it hard enough, these out-of-body experiences that are associated with trance. So, we get that same sense. I don't think you get it on quite as high a plane as you might do in a religious context, but you can get the same sense of uplift and joy, if you like, in almost any secular context. And we do, laughter, sort of gives us a sense of relaxation and feeling bonded with whoever we're laughing with around the table. It tends to be a very small group that experiences that. Literally, only 3 or 4 people in a social setting who are actually engaged with each other. Whereas in contrast, a religious experience of the same kind can happen to many hundreds, perhaps even thousands of people at the same time. There's a difference in scale, but it's still the same thing. It's part and parcel of the bonding processes that have evolved in humans to allow us to create these large communities. But I am left with the sense that religion has a particularly powerful effect compared to any of the others. It capitalizes on all, as I mentioned right at the beginning, on all the others of the various kinds of bonding processes: laughter, singing, dancing, feasting, eating meals, and storytelling, and so on. They're all there severally and jointly, as they say, in most of the big religions in some form or other. Perhaps in some branches of Christianity they don't do too much laughter, but in religious context. But there are Christian sects that do. And what it does is seem to produce this sense of belonging, commitment, that allows the community to work then as a community. But there does seem to be an added value, I think. This is kind of my impression, looking in, as it were, dispassionately from the outside. When you add in a religious component to it, effectively you have a kind of theology, if you like. There's something about that gives it an extra uplift and makes it a much more powerful bonding factor for the community. Well, I don't have an explanation for how that is, or particularly. There are some obvious ones. They're what the theologians tell you.
Yes. Yeah.
And that may indeed well be true. So but the point is that there's something about the spiritual dimension. When you add the kind of spiritual dimension to these everyday bonding things in the form of religion, it gives it an extra uplift that seems to be terribly, terribly important.
Is it only humans who seem predisposed to religious beliefs or religious practices, or do some non-human animals share such a predisposition?
That is the great question at the center of the universe, Buki. My answer to that, which is simply, if you like, an informed best guess, is that religion is peculiar to humans. And it's peculiar to humans because it actually depends on being able to add in to the physiological experiences associated with all the rituals of religion, the singing of hymns, the listening to emotionally uplifting stories from the readings from the Bible or whatever it may be, the kneeling and the praying and having your heart wrung for you by deeply moving prayers or whatever it may be. All these things that are kind of the engine, if you like, of creating this sense of religiosity. That there's something about the capacity to understand that the world is peopled by many different kinds of individuals. Keep it fairly general at this point. One of whom, in the end, will be God, right? And that capacity to think through that my beliefs about your beliefs and how they relate to God's beliefs or God's view, et cetera, is something that only humans can do. It's part of a natural sequence of self-reflectiveness, which is known as mentalizing, or in its simplest form, theory of mind. And the simplest form of that, which is what's formally known as theory of mind in cognitive psychology, and is the capacity for you to believe that I imagine something's the case. Right? It's your mind and my mind engaged together inside your mind. That doesn't appear until about the age of 5 in children. But we expand that as we go through childhood and teenagehood until we get up to what appears to be natural human levels of performance, which is 5 orders of mentalizing. So we've gone through theory of mind, or what's known as second order, mentalizing at the age of 5, but probably not till we get to the late teens do we get to the fully adult form, which involves the capacity to reflect on 5 different mind states at the same time. So mine and yours, or me reflecting on your mind state, and then your mind reflecting on somebody else's mind state, and eventually being able to slot God in at the top, God's view of the world, if you like, God's mind state. That seems to produce something which radically changes the belief state you have. So, okay, if we look around the world, most animals have what's called first order intentionality or mentalizing. They believe that something's the case. Their experiences tell them, and they believe, if they hear about a loud bang, that danger threatens or what have you. And this is crucial for animals with brains anyway to survive in this world. And then we have second order intentionality. So I believe that you believe that something is the case. Well, now we're getting into primate territory. So it looks pretty much like the great apes can all do that, and 5-year-old humans can do that. And then it gradually, we can add more and more different mind states, or we can go backwards and forwards. I believe that you suppose that I'm wondering whether you think that as a normal adult, we can do 5 of those mentalizing states at the same time. Now, it seems to me when you look at what's possible, your thinking capacity, if you like, the different layers of mind states, as they've evolved through the course of human evolution, that there's a real sea change between fourth order intentionality, as it's known, and fifth order being characteristic of most adult humans. That's the average. When we vary a little around that. Some are super smart and can do 6 orders. Some of us are not so good at these things and can only do 4. But the average seems to be about 5. What seems to happen at that stage? So the archaic humans, the Neanderthals, and so on, just on the basis of their brain size, this correlates very tightly with brain size, were very competent fourth order intentionalities. I think they could have some religion on the basis of that. It's not very sophisticated religion as we would see it from our modern perspective. Yes. But I'm sure it seemed very sophisticated to them. And it was certainly very much more sophisticated than anything that any previous members of our evolutionary lineage could have aspired to, and clearly better than the great apes, because the great apes are operating at about the same level as 5-6-year-old children. So they can have beliefs about beliefs, as it were, beliefs about your beliefs. And that has all sorts of practical consequences for them, because if I believe that you suppose something is the case, I can very cunningly deceive you. Right? Yes. So deception in that sense is very primitive. But having 5 orders of intentionality to play about allows you to have religious, or if you like, kind of in inverted commas, theological views, which are very much more sophisticated. And in fact, if we agree, commit us, both of us, to these things. Whereas I don't think that was true of archaic humans, the Neanderthals. They could kind of go fourth order intentionalities. They had, one could have said, well, I believe in a spirit that runs the universe, and must all good. And the response to that really is going to be, well, if you say so. But I don't believe it. Whereas once you have fifth order, it's almost as though you go through a magic doorway into another world, where suddenly it allows you, commits both of you to believing very sophisticated religious propositions, if you like, and so on. So fifth order seems to be extremely important in the emergence of a sense of a spirit world that's a parallel universe to the one we live and breathe in, and to go and experience it, which they regularly did through trance states and so on. But at that point, that's really a consequence of the size of computers that they had evolved, which as a byproduct, in some sense, I mean, the size of the computer, size of the brain is all about bonding communities, how you bond very large communities in primates. But there's something almost magical that seems to happen when your computer becomes big enough. It has enough computing power to do stuff which is much more sophisticated. And one of those seems to be to have these deeply meaningful philosophical and theological beliefs about the world, which both tie us together as a community, but also tie you into a spirit world, if you like.